Hello friends, and welcome to a new chapter of Sherlock Holmes. I hope you like it and subscribe my channel. Let's go. The Adventure of the Speckled Band. I'm sorry to wake you, Watson, whispered Holmes as he stood over me. But we have a visitor. There's a young woman in the sitting room who wants to see us. I'm sure it's important if she's come at this hour. Would you care to join me? My dear Holmes, I replied sleepily, I wouldn't miss it for the world. I always enjoyed helping my colleague in his investigations. It was fascinating to watch him gather clues and use them to solve crimes. So I dressed quickly and joined him in the sitting room. We beheld a woman dressed in black, wearing a veil over her face. Good morning, madame, began my companion. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my friend and partner, Dr. Watson. How can we be of service to you? The woman lifted the veil from her face. We could see that she was pale and upset. I am very frightened, Mr. Holmes, she began. We will try our best to help you, Holmes said, trying to calm her. I see that you traveled to London by train this morning, and that you rode to the train station in a horse-drawn wagon. How do you know that? She asked with a look of surprise on her face. The return ticket is tucked into your glove, Holmes explained, and the left arm of your jacket is splashed with fresh mud. You could only have gotten splashed that way by sitting on the left-hand side of an open wagon. You're correct, she replied. I have traveled all this way because I'm going mad, Mr. Holmes. I have no one to turn to. You must help me. Please, madame, tell us your problem. Holmes sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened. My name is Helen Stoner. I live with my stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott. He is the last member of an old family. They were wealthy once, but over the years the Roylotts lost their fortune. All that remains is the family home, Stoke Moran. Years ago, my stepfather lived in India and had a successful medical practice. That is where he met and married my mother. My twin sister Julia and I were only 2 at the time. It was in India that my stepfather's troubles began. She said, in a fit of anger, he got into a fight, killed someone, and spent many years in prison. When my stepfather was released, we moved back to England, where he returned to being a doctor. But he was a changed man by then. Shortly after our return, my mother passed away, leaving all her money to my stepfather. My sister and I would receive some money of our own, but only when we got married. With my mother gone, we left London and went to live in Stoke Moran. Miss Stoner grew more upset as she continued her story. My stepfather became even more troubled after that. His temper grew, and later he was arrested by the police for fighting. People became afraid of him. His only friends were a group of poor travelers who roamed the countryside and sometimes visited Stoke Moran. He would often let them camp in the woods near the house. His behavior grew stranger with every passing day, she continued. He loves wild animals, so he brought a wild cheetah and a baboon from India, letting them run wild in the woods around our home. My sister Julia and I became very unhappy. No servants would stay with us, so my sister and I took care of that big house by ourselves. It was very hard for us. Julia was 30 when she died, but she looked much older. Your sister is dead? Asked Holmes. Yes, our visitor replied. She died 2 years ago, and it is her death that I wish to speak to you about. Just before that sad event, Julia became engaged. My stepfather did not object, but just before the wedding, a terrible thing happened. When Holmes heard this, he opened his eyes and looked at our visitor. "Do not leave out any details," he said. Miss Stoner continued. "My stepfather, sister, and I lived in only one part of the old house. Julia's bedroom was between mine and my stepfather's, on the main floor. There are no doors connecting the rooms, but they all share the same hallway. The windows of the rooms look out on the yard. That night 2 years ago, all three of us were in our rooms. While I was still awake, my sister came to me. She said she could smell my stepfather's cigar smoke and that it bothered her. So we sat and talked about her wedding until about 11 o'clock. That's when she got up to return to her room. As she was leaving, Julia asked me if I had heard a whistling sound at night. She told me she had heard such a sound for the last few nights, but she did not know where the noise had come from. I told her it might have been the travelers who were camped nearby. I sleep more soundly than she, which might explain why I heard nothing. After that, we said good night. My sister returned to her room, and I heard her lock her door. "Did you always lock your doors?" asked Holmes. "Yes," answered Miss Stoner. "We were afraid of my father's wild animals." "Continue," said Holmes. "Well, that night," she went on, "I could not sleep and lay awake for hours. Suddenly I heard Julia scream. I jumped from my bed and ran into the hallway. At that moment I heard a quiet whistle, followed by a loud clanging sound. In the hallway I watched as Julia's bedroom door opened. My dear sister slowly stepped from her room. I saw terror in her eyes. She could barely stand and she moved about as if she was in pain. I ran to her just as she fell to the floor. As I held her in my arms, she cried out, 'Oh, Helen, it was the band, the Speckled band.' She reached out with one hand and pointed to my stepfather's room. I called out to him and he quickly appeared. But there was nothing we could do. That night, Julia died." "And you are sure," asked Holmes, "that you heard the whistle and clanging sound of metal?" "I think I did," Miss Stoner replied. "I am sure a doctor examined your sister's body. What did he find?" asked Holmes. "He knew of our stepfather's temper, Mr. Holmes, and was very careful, but he did not find what killed Julia. It is still a mystery. We know that Julia had locked both the windows and the bedroom door. We searched the room carefully, but couldn't find any hidden entrances. My sister must have been alone when she met her end. Besides, she didn't have any marks on her." "What about poison?" asked Holmes. "The doctor found no trace of it," replied the young woman. "Mr. Holmes, I believe she died of fright. And I think that when my sister said the word band, she meant band of people, like the band of travelers. Well, that was 2 years ago. I have come to see you, Mr. Holmes, because a month ago I became engaged also. Again, my stepfather did not object. My fiancé and I are to be married in the spring. But 2 days ago," she said with a fearful look on her face, "work began on some walls of our house. And because of the repairs, I had to move into my sister's bedroom. As you can imagine, I did not feel comfortable. Then, last night, as I lay in bed, I suddenly heard a noise. It was the sound of a quiet whistle. I jumped out of bed and lighted a lamp. I didn't see anything, but I was so scared that I dressed and dared not go to bed. In the morning, I left the house and came to London to beg for your help."